Okay, let's bring in Alexey Muraviev, who's an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. He joins me live from Perth. Welcome to you, Professor. Is it fair to say that Russia's economy has adapted to fuel itself through war?
It seems to be this way. We need to recognize that the Russian economy has been diversifying itself for quite some time. Besides, it was under sanctions since probably around 2012. So the shock, the tsunami of sanctions that came its way in 2022 wasn't a real surprise. I think the Russians kind of did a bit of calculations and foreplanning in order to understand this is what they would probably expect that would come their way. But because they had a bit of a grace period, especially that is particularly relevant to Russia's defense sector that was under tight sanctions since probably about 2014. So it had a bit of a adaptability period and which allowed it to start standing on its own or find alternative ways to bypass the sanctions regime.
It's kind of a common sentiment at the end of relationships. The West sort of said to Russia, without us, you'll be nothing. But instead, Russia turned to China, India, to some extent to Africa. Was it naive of Western nations not to foresee that?
Look, I think it was incredibly naive. I mean, simply look at the map, the country of 9 time zones that stretches from Eastern Europe to the Arctic all the way to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, expecting that this country can somehow be locked up behind yet another form of Iron Curtain without having the ideological restraints of the Soviet Union. I think it's kind of was real hope that it didn't have anything to do with reality. I mean, the Russians were blissfully ignoring the Pacific angle, even though the two-headed eagle sort of suggests that it should be looking both ways. But nonetheless, they were still busy developing and strengthening ties with pivotal Asian economies. They were incredibly busy in the Middle East and now and as well as in Africa, and now they kind of capitalizing on their success that they managed to achieve over the past decade or so.
There were several reports that the UK, for example, still buys Russian oil, not directly from Russia, but Russia sells it to India and China, they refine it, then the UK buys it, and the UK must know this is happening. So whilst condemning Russia, is it not pretty hypocritical of countries like the UK to be doing that?
Look, I think it's a clear indication that business is business when it comes to that sort of arrangements. We've seen really funny relationships been going on between the Third Reich and a number of European nations during the Second World War. I can clearly see some sort of repetition of it now. And yes, the Russians managed to find loopholes. The Russians managed to import highly sensitive technologies from the countries that formally impose sanctions upon them, including from the UK, including from the US, including from other nations. So I think there is a degree of innovation there. And on one hand, if it comes to kind of Russia trying to bypass sanctions, and I think there is a degree of hypocrisy when it comes to some of the Western counterparts that may still be declaring and stating that they are there to bring the Russian economy down to its knees, but money talk at the end of the day, and the Russians sell something, I guess someone is not prepared to refuse or say no to.
Professor, great to speak to you. My guest, Alexey Muraviev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University.